Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us today for this session on menopause in the workplace. So, quick introduction, my name is Katie Burley. I'm one of the senior associates here in the employment team at Field Seymour Parks. Now, I'm not going to prolong the start of this too much because there are some, as you can see from the screen in front of you, that there are lots of far more interesting people probably than me that I'm here to talk to you today. But I do just have a couple of housekeeping points that I'm going to start off with, so please bear with me while I run through those. As you are probably very much aware, the session today is being held remotely, so please do bear with us if we have any technical difficulties. We're obviously trying to resolve those as swiftly as we possibly can. The webinar today will be no longer than an hour and 15 minutes long. You are all on mute, so all attendees are all on mute, but if you do have any questions, please do feel free to leave them in the question box that you should see somewhere on your screen. We'd really love to hear from you. We'll endeavour to answer as many questions that you have at the end of the webinar. Now, there are going to be some interactive polls throughout the webinar. Those who come to some of our seminars before will be familiar with those. Please do get involved with those. We'd absolutely love to hear your answers to some questions that we'd like to raise. Now, for those of you who would like a copy of Jackie's slides, which is going to be the legal section, those will be available to download whilst the webinar is live. So whilst we're also talking today, if you go to the handout section of your screen, you should be able to find Jackie's slides in there for you to keep a copy if you'd like. The webinar is being recorded today. A copy will be sent out to all attendees, might be later today, maybe tomorrow, depending on how timescales work out. But do keep an eye on your inbox. That should be filtering through to you at some point over the next few days, and you are very welcome to forward that to colleagues, friends, anyone who you think might be interested in what we've had to say today. As with all of our sessions, we'd really appreciate some feedback on this webinar today. At the end of the session, you will automatically have a screen pop up that will have a survey. So if you could complete that when the survey ends, that would be absolutely wonderful. There is the chance to win a £50 John Lewis voucher for those who to complete the survey, with one individual chosen at random and notified over the next few days. So a little bit of an incentive there to help get that feedback, because we really, really do value that. That will be massively appreciated. Right. As I said, you've got some other faces on your screen there today that you may or may not be familiar with, so I'm just going to quickly run through them. I won't go into great detail because I'm sure they will tell you all about themselves in due course in their separate sections. But we firstly have Michelle Gascoigne, who is from an organisation called Henpicked Menopause in the Workplace Limited, and that's Michelle just over there. We have Rebecca McAllister from Savills UK Limited. Rebecca's actually the head of the planning department in the Reading office, very busy lady, and we're very grateful to all of our individuals for coming along today. And then we have Emma Thomas, who works at a large academic publishing company, and she's got a lot of things that she'll be showing us today. You know, really wonderful speakers. We're very, very grateful to have them all here today. And last but not least, I shouldn't forget, of course, Jackie Denham, who is also one of the senior associates in the employment team here at FSP. And Jackie has kindly agreed to cover all the legal side of things. So our intention today, hopefully, the plan is to give you a solid introduction into the topic of menopause, how it can impact your workplace and your workforce, you know, what the legal risks are, what you can do to help engage with your employees about it, and all of those sorts of things. So it should be a really nice, good overview to get you started. In terms of the running order of today, we're going to start off with information about really what the menopause is all about, to give you a bit of an idea. So the whys, the whats, the whens, all of those sorts of things. We're then going to be moving on to the legal side. So in other words, you know, if you're not really sure why you're here, or you didn't really particularly care about it in the first place, why we're saying that you now need to. We're then going to be hearing from our industry guest speakers, who will be sharing some of their experiences stating implementing policies and levels of channels of support within their own workplaces. Hopefully that will give you some nice ideas and inspiration to take back to the offices with you in due course. At the end, we're then going to have a little panel session where all of our speakers are going to be invited to join in some group discussion points, and then followed by the Q&A session from you all. So as I say, if you've got any questions as we go through, please do pop those in the box and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can. Just one little point to note, obviously Jackie's legal section aside, a lot of the content that we're going to be running today is going to be sharing of experiences, giving opinions, and you know, telling stories about things that have worked or have not worked within different organisations. So we really do hope you get a lot of inspiration from today, but also it pretty much goes without saying that please do bear in mind that what might work for one business or for one individual may not automatically work for every different business out there or every different individual. So when taking anything with you, please do be sure just to apply that to your own business or individual circumstances as appropriate. Right. enough introductions. Let's get started. So I'm going to kick us off today with the first of our interactive polls, which should hopefully pop up onto your screen. And this is quite a nice sort of little introductory question for us all to get an idea of where you all are within your workplaces and how far you are on your own particular workplace journey. So I'm hoping that's going to pop up shortly. Right, there it is. Okay, excellent. So the first question that we're going to ask you is, does your workplace currently offer any of the following? And you've got a list there, and if you'd just like to select all that apply, that would be super. I would just say that there are no right or wrong answers with the polls. There is no prize for getting it right or wrong. We just want you to be honest, because it's really interesting to get a feel for where everybody is at the moment. So I will give you a couple of answers just to run through those. So you've got menopause policy, free advice or information, menopause training for management and or employees at different levels, internal support groups, mentoring, or indeed none of the above if you haven't even got started yet. So we'll give you a couple more seconds and hopefully the results of those will pop up shortly. Let's have a look. Actually, it's very interesting, I think. A pretty mixed bag there, but equally not surprising at all that there are lots and lots of responses there that are saying that nobody's actually got, a lot of you haven't got any of these in place. I think at the moment that's probably to be expected. This is clearly, it's a new area in the grand scheme of the workplace as it has been. A few years ago, I think it would have been pretty niche to have any sort of level of menopause support in the workplace, but it is certainly becoming more common. And in a few years' time, we really do anticipate that it's likely to be the norm. And now I'm actually going to pass over to our first speaker today, I think, which leads in quite nicely to that, someone who's obviously leading the charge for this to actually be the norm, and is doing a wonderful job in doing so. So Michelle, I will pass over to you. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Very much. So yeah, it's really good to see those types of honesty, I think, coming through on that poll. So that's great. So yes, thank you to Jackie and to Field Seymour Parks for inviting me to be part of this panel today. So my name is Michelle. I'm an associate coach for an organisation called Henpick Menopause in the Workplace, and we're the leading provider of menopause support and training across all sectors. We've got two key passions. The first one is ensuring that everyone has access to the information that they need to be able to make the right decisions around their menopause journey, but also that they get the right support and information from within their workplace to be able to continue in roles that they absolutely love. And you'll hear a lot more of that from my fellow panelists as to what their organisations have done to help that. So for the next 10 minutes, and I will do everything I can to keep to time, I really will be covering in brief the menopause, what it is, why does it happen, and when. And it's the when that might come as quite a surprise for many on the call today. We're going to look at the symptoms of menopause, and here I would really like to focus on the not so well spoken about symptoms. But we're also going to look at how these might impact within the workplace. So again, here you might be surprised at the top 5 that were most reported from a piece of work we're going to discuss. So when looking at that impact within the workplace, but I think the one thing that we can all agree is it is urgent and it is important. So delighted to see so many of you on the call today. I would also like to add at this point that whilst I might use the terms woman, female and her, this discussion is inclusive of and recognises that people from different communities can also experience menopausal symptoms, and more of that in a moment. So we go straight back to basics. What is the definition of menopause? Well, clearly it states it is the ceasing of menstruation. It is considered to have occurred when no periods have been experienced for 12 consecutive months. Now, we understand that the average age of menopause is 51. It will usually occur between the ages of 45 and 55, but it can occur into the 60s, but more importantly, it can occur earlier. We're told that 1% of those aged between 12 and 40 can experience menopause. And when this occurs, it's known as POI. So that's premature ovarian insufficiency. So here I'd like you to consider a young person who has maybe started their periods or just started their journey into family planning, and their periods have ceased or they're struggling with fertility. And further investigation, and this can be really intensive, really intrusive, and quite lengthy investigation, can actually show that they've gone through the menopause. And as I say, this is known as POI, premature ovarian insufficiency. It was the theme of World Menopause Day a couple of years ago. If any of you saw the Davina McCall program, which was really groundbreaking when it came to TV production, it really was. And she did so much about busting myths and lifting the lid on this conversation. You may have met a young lady called Hayley. Now, she was in her mid-teens when she was diagnosed as having gone through her menopause. And she's now in her 30s, and she's doing an amazing job to support so many people, as is a really good charity called the Daisy Network, and they provide amazing support to thousands of those who have experienced this and their families. Because if you think, there's a lot of implication here. There's the physical side of them now living as a post-menopause person, and I'll go into more detail what that means, but also that fact that a lot of decisions may have been taken away from them, you know, with regard to family planning and how they map out their life, etc. So there's quite a lot, and also they haven't got that peer support. You know, they might not have that age because those around them might not be experiencing this as well. We also know that between 10 and 15, aged between the age of 40 and 45, might experience the menopause, and this is considered early menopause. So again, might be not with that peer support. It might be a lot earlier than expected. Now, when we talk about menopause, it's quite easy to think that everybody will experience the menopause in exactly the same way. For many, they might experience a natural menopause, but for many others, they may experience their menopause through surgical and or medical intervention. So just to give you a little definition here, if a hysterectomy is performed and the ovaries are retained, then the individual is likely to menopause within the next 5 years, as the health of the ovaries has been compromised. But also, if the ovaries are removed as part of that procedure and or removed as part of a bilateral oophorectomy for treatment, it's looking at where the focus might be here, so that it's on the recovery and the condition that's been treated, whereas in fact now there has to be that level of support to know what might that mean, because they've entered menopause instantly. I always say it happened to me at 38. It took the 45 minutes it took to come around in recovery for me to hit the menopause, and it can be quite impactful. So it's about understanding and making sure we're giving support across the ground. So we have to look at what age these might be occurring. So we might have individuals living longer post-menopause. So what is actually happening? Well, in a natural menopause, in the time leading that one point in time when a period has not been experienced for 12 months, we have what's called perimenopause. And this is where this fluctuation, particularly of estrogen, can start to have an impact. When it clashes then with that naturally declining levels of progesterone as we pass through our fertile years, you can get that clash. So think of an orchestra when everything's in tune and time, the sound is amazing, but start to go off time, start to go off sound, and you get that clash. And it can be really impactful, and that's when a lot of these symptoms are being experienced, and they can have a massive impact. I did say that there are others who might experience menopausal symptoms, so here we need to understand that there may be some who have the biological makeup to experience menopause but don't identify as a female. There might be others who are having treatment, such as chemotherapy, that can trigger those menopausal type symptoms. There might be others who are having treatment as part of their own transitional journey, and those hormones themselves can trigger those menopausal type symptoms. So that's where we are when we're talking about inclusivity. You may have heard of the word andropause. It's a media term, but yes, it's looking at that steady decline in key hormones for such as testosterone, where some symptoms might be experienced for those who biologically can't experience the menopause, but they might start to really feel those symptoms. And if they are, then medical care to be given for a number of reasons. Very briefly looking at the symptoms. Now here, NICE guidelines state there's 34 recognised symptoms, and I'm sure many of you could name every single one of them and think of 100 more. But For many, the symptoms we often talk about are the headliners, and I want you to move away from thinking about those headliners such as the hot sweats, the night sweats, the cold sweats, the insomnia and the mood swings. I want you to consider things like palpitations, loss of self-confidence, that brain fog, maybe that slowness in processing, and we'll talk about how that might be impacting within the workplace. Think about irritability, panic attacks, tearful, headaches, migraines, heavy light periods, what impact they might be having. Why? It's all to do with 3 key hormones. Estrogen, involved in over 300 functions within the body. Moisturizing, a lubricating hormone, supports brain health, heart health, bone health. It also supports healthy maintenance of cholesterol levels. We've got progesterone, our sleep-inducing calming hormone. And then we've got testosterone, our self-confidence and our self-belief. So you start to see the connection there, symptoms versus what's actually causing it. We did some work with the TUC. We looked at the top 5 most impactful symptoms within the workplace. And the ones that came out top were fatigue, hot flushes or hot flashes, focus and concentration, anxiety and worry, and insomnia. So think about how that might be impacting within the workplace. And also look at what impact the workplace can have on those symptoms. Yes, many of us have been working from home, so it can be a lot easier, but we've had maybe heightened experience of those psychological symptoms, heightened anxiety, and maybe anxiety about coming back into the workplace, commuting and things like that. But think about if you're working with high temperatures, if you've got poor ventilation in your workplace, high levels of humidity could cause problems. Not having access to that quiet, that restful space. Excessive noise when you're trying to focus, trying to concentrate, or maybe migraines and headaches are one of your symptoms or somebody's symptoms. Dryness and lack of natural light. We've talked about eyes, skin, hair, moisture, just that muscles, all sorts of things, lots of heavy stairs, heavy lifting, whatever your teams might be doing. So above all, I want to invite you to know on the call today, as I finish, that everyone is different. Symptoms can be managed. They will all be experienced differently because 3 out of 4 will experience menopause symptoms. 1 out of 4 will not. But of that 3, that 4, 1 in 4 could really find their life at home and within the workplace impacted. But above all, please remember, symptoms do not have to be really bad or unbearable before help is available. And when we've got 1 in 4 seriously considering leaving their place of work, these conversations are not only urgent, but they are vitally important. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, oh my goodness, thank you so much, Michelle. That was incredibly insightful and quite the education. I think there's a bit of background for you all. We started with Michelle today as we felt that it was actually quite important that people understand the bigger picture here when it comes to menopause before we get into the legal side of things, and the more practical things that many of you will want to know about. And I think the detail that Michelle has just given us there, it speaks volumes. It speaks for itself. If any of us are in doubt about why there needs to be, there is a desperate need for education on this topic, Michelle's done an absolutely fantastic job of making that quite clear for us. Something I actually wanted to ask you, Michelle, that's just not necessarily about what you've exactly just said just now, but actually on a wider level of your experience. I'm just wondering, there's clearly times where individuals themselves, be having a range of symptoms. They don't know it's the menopause. They've got, they don't realise what's going on. I'm thinking about things from a purely workplace perspective. How can managers bring it to the table? How can managers start that sort of conversation? Have you got any sort of advice on that?
It's a really difficult one because it's actually one of the scenarios we use. You think that somebody within your team is experiencing the menopause or might be. How do you reach out and how do you give that advice? Well, first prompt is you do not ask, do you think you're going through the menopause? So that's the first one. But it is about not making assumptions, because I think, as I've highlighted, people can be any age and they can experience the menopause for any number of reasons. So I think often the first question is, how are you? No. Are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help? And also letting people know you're open about having the conversation around menopause, because that then will allow people to come forward and make them feel more comfortable in coming forward to have that conversation. But diagnosis of menopause is not an easy journey at all. There's lots of factors I could have gone into. So often, yes, it is very frequent that the individual might not know themselves actually where they are with this journey. Yeah.
I think ask, open the dialogue, and I think that's going to be a very key message that's going to run throughout today. You know, we really want to get to the stage where women are not feeling like they've got no option but to resign. You know, it's a huge waste of talent that we've got. You know, women at the peak of their careers feeling they're going to have to walk away quite often, individuals, and yes, you know, it's a very, very valid point there. Can I just ask, why do you think that so many of us know so little about this? You know, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there wondering, well, come on, this isn't something new. Women have been going through this forever, literally. You know, we didn't know about it before. Why do we need to know about it before? You know, too much information, everybody. We don't want to know about this yet, but clearly we do need to know. So why don't we? Where's the gap?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, people say, well, why are we talking about it now? If you look back 100 years, you know, we hear figures around, you know, average age of menopause 57, life expectancy 59. We're now looking at about 51. A number of reasons as to why might be happening, earlier start of puberty, etc. But we're now working into our late 60s, possibly into our early 70s. We're living 80, 90, 100, so we're living that much longer. And there are lots of external factors, environmental factors that can also be triggering it. And we're known as the sandwich generation. We've got younger dependents, we've got older dependents. As you said, we're at the peak of our career for many roles that we've worked for years to go, but we're still juggling, we're still managing. And it just has become much more impactful. And we're not told about it at school. We're taught about puberty, about, you know, fertility and pregnancy and everything else, and yet this massive chapter in our lives that can be a real turning point, and a positive turning point for so many, we just know nothing about at the moment.
No, absolutely. And actually, interestingly, a colleague sent Jackie and I an article that was published in the Times over this weekend about the well-known public boys' school, Harrow. And it was saying they have actually just engaged somebody to teach their pupils about the menopause, which I literally thought was wonderful. You know, if we can get that education into an early stage, it becomes something that's not taboo, not something that we feel awkward talking about, then hopefully that will make a difference and make these kind of conversations in the workplace and everywhere else in life a little bit easier. So, oh goodness, thank you so much, Michelle. That was absolutely wonderful. Obviously, we'll talk to you a little bit more with the Q&A session towards the end. I do have another poll for you now, which actually links quite nicely to what we've just been saying. So hopefully that poll will pop up on your screen in just a moment. Yep, there it is. Wonderful. So this one is, how comfortable do you currently feel talking about the menopause with your colleagues? And I'm sure that, again, there's going to be a mixed bag of responses to this one. It'll be interesting to see where you all sit at the moment. So the options that you've got there are very comfortable, fairly comfortable, not very comfortable, or not at all comfortable. As I say, no right or wrong answers here, just nice to see what everyone is thinking. So I will give you a couple of moments just to select your answer. That one, and the results should pop up shortly. Here they go. Fairly comfortable. That's actually very interesting, and it's nice to hear. And I think, you know, for those of you who do feel either very or fairly comfortable, well, you know, that's absolutely wonderful. You know, well done, bravo, hurrah. You know, the first part of your battle, I think, in taking this forward within the workplace is complete, and so that's absolutely excellent. And for those of you who are, you know, slightly more on the side of not feeling quite so comfortable, well, you are absolutely not alone. Hopefully today's session will help with some of that and give you some ideas of how this can be something that could be more easily spoken about in the workplace. Right, we are now going to move on to Jackie. Jackie is going to talk us through the legal aspects of this situation. So Jackie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can we start with my slides, please, Lauren? So I wanted to talk obviously as quickly as I can about all the different legal risks that might be available. And I think it's really important for me to highlight that there is a shockingly low amount of cases that have been through the tribunals that mention the word menopause, and that cannot be reflective of the number of people that might potentially be bringing a claim. It might either be that they don't have the confidence bringing it in a public arena, or that perhaps they don't even know at the time, because there's such a short period of time they've got in which to bring an employment claim, they might not even know that they were menopausal at the time. So there might be various reasons for this, but what you do need to know is that the numbers of cases that mention menopause are rapidly increasing, and I have no doubt that that will continue to be the case given the amount of media coverage and the amount of awareness that is being increased over the last couple of years. We're about 18 months behind in terms of tribunals at the minute, so there is no doubt that in the future that knock-on effect will start happening, and we need to all be ready and prepared for this. There is currently no legislation that specifically talks about menopause, but there is a whole range of legislation and protection that is currently out there and is can be relied on by individuals already. I'm going to start with health and safety obligations, because all companies have an obligation to ensure their health, safety and welfare of their employees. And what that means is ensuring that their workplace and their work practices do not make menopausal symptoms worse. That means carrying out a proper risk assessment of their workplace, which includes the specific needs of menopausal workers. And it means when you identify the risks that they face, taking action to prevent or minimise exposure to those risks. And Michelle's already talked as briefly as she can about some of the things that can be done, but I think it's looking at, most workplaces will have to look at things like, are the temperature of the workplace easily adjustable? Is there adequate ventilation? Is there easy access to toilet facilities? Is there easy access at all times to cold drinking water? Is there a place to go and get changed, a place to go and rest if necessary? It needs to think about all those factors. Looking at employment legislation itself, next slide please. Anybody who's got 2 years service will have the right to bring an unfair dismissal claim if their employer does not have a fair reason for dismissal. So of course, if someone is dismissed because they are experiencing menopausal symptoms or because they're hit a certain age, then of course they would have an unfair dismissal claim. Even if an employer has one of the 5 fair reasons for dismissal, for example, if an individual is genuinely potentially redundant, or they have genuine performance or conduct concerns, that doesn't mean that they can still be dismissed fairly. You have to follow a proper process prior to making the decision to dismiss. And for someone who has an underlying medical condition, that process is going to be quite detailed as to what's expected of you. You're going to have to follow the ACAS code as a minimum. You're going to have to consult really carefully. You might have to also get medical advice. And whatever decision you come to, it has to be within the band of reasonable responses of an employer in those circumstances. In addition, all employment contracts have an implied term of mutual trust and confidence between your employer and your employee. If an employer treats someone unreasonably, or they're creating an unpleasant working environment for someone, or they're not taking their menopausal conditions seriously, that could all be reasons why an individual could resign and claim constructive dismissal on the basis that that employer has broken that trust and confidence between the parties. Now, those particular claims require this 2 years of service before you can bring them, but it's important that I highlight that if someone has raised health and safety concerns in the workplace, they could potentially have additional protection. If you raise, for example, health and safety concerns to say that you think that your employer might not be complying with their health and safety obligations, if you are then dismissed in response to raising that concern, then you could be protected from automatic unfair dismissal. And automatic unfair dismissal is a day 1 right that doesn't require any length of qualifying service before you can bring it. I also wanted to highlight that some employers, if you have a contractual obligation, for example, in your employment contract, you'll have a load of obligations and commitments in there, or separately, you might have a contractual policy. If either of those things exist and you are not complying with what you have committed to doing, again, that employer might bring a breach of contract claim. So, for example, if you have a contractual commitment in a policy that says that for every individual with an underlying medical condition, you will get medical advice prior to making any formal disciplinary or capability process, then if you don't follow that commitment, they could potentially have a breach of contract claim against you. Next slide, please, Lauren. Now, these particular types of claim are all likely to be capped at 1 year's salary or just under £90,000, whichever is the lower. And that is why it's important for me to also highlight that the majority of claims that would be brought by menopausal or perimenopausal people are likely to also include some element of a discrimination claim. And that is because if you win on a discrimination claim, your losses financial losses are uncapped, and you may also be entitled to an award for injury to feelings in addition. Now, obviously, the vast majority of people will be protected by a discrimination legislation in some form. There's 9 protected characteristics that are covered. All individuals who are experiencing some form of menopausal or perimenopausal symptoms will be covered by sex discrimination. They're probably also going to be covered by age discrimination, the vast majority. Some transgender, non-binary or intersex people can, as Michelle's already explained, can also be affected, and they might therefore also have the protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And for anybody who's experiencing the more severe symptoms, they may also actually be covered by disability discrimination legislation, which actually provides even further protections than other discrimination types. Now, the definition of disability within the Equality Act is that it needs to be a mental or physical impairment that has a substantial adverse impact on a person's ability to carry out their normal day-to-day activities, and it needs to be long-term. So in terms of 2 of those different elements of that definition, pretty much everybody who's experiencing symptoms will be covered, because it's a mental or physical impairment and it's going to last longer than 12 months. The key here as to whether someone's covered by discrimination, the disability discrimination legislation will be about whether it's a substantial adverse impact on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. And you might think the substantial is a really high bar, but it's not. The definition of substantial is more than minor or trivial. And actually, the tribunals themselves have already said that they cannot see any reason in principle why typical menopausal symptoms could not amount to a disability. So I need to flag this, because actually there is a large proportion of your workers that at some point might therefore be covered by disability discrimination legislation you had no idea would be. The other thing I need to highlight is that in terms of deciding if someone is covered by that definition of disability, any treatment they're receiving, medical treatment they're receiving, is disregarded. So even if you've got someone who is receiving medical treatment, for example, HRT, that is successfully managing all their symptoms, you completely disregard that in terms of working out whether they're entitled to the additional protections under disability discrimination. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to run through really quickly the heads of discrimination claims, because then I can give you some examples about what behaviours might be acceptable or not. So starting with direct discrimination, that's when someone is treated less favourably because of a protected characteristic. The most obvious example would be if someone's missed out on promotion or has been dismissed because of their menopausal symptoms. That would constitute direct discrimination. A less obvious example, but one that is important to highlight because it has been in some of the cases that have been through the tribunals. If an employer treats an employee with menopause symptoms differently than they would treat a man with a medical condition, that again could amount to direct discrimination. So for example, if an employer would have referred a man with symptoms for medical advice, or they would have considered that symptom as a mitigation in a performance management process, it would be direct sex discrimination if you wouldn't take the same steps for a woman with menopausal symptoms. Next slide, please. Indirect discrimination, slightly harder to recognise potentially. That's if an employer has any provision, criterion or practice in place that on the surface of it applies across the board to everybody equally, but that the actual impact of it places those with a protected characteristic at a disadvantage. I've put some examples on the list. I'm not going to go through all of them, but for example, if you had a uniform policy that and you gave everybody across the board 2 sets of uniform in order to carry out the role, but you had a policy that said if they need extra sets of uniform, they have to pay for that out of their own pocket. If you had that approach, obviously, that would place those who are suffering from hot flushes at a disadvantage, because they're more likely to have to purchase additional sets of uniform out of their own money. Now, it is important that you understand that not everything that potentially is indirect discrimination would be unlawful. There is something in the legislation that allows the company to objectively justify the approach they're taking, but that's quite a high bar. What it means is that you need to be trying to achieve a legitimate aim, and that the approach you're taking is a proportionate means of achieving that aim. And what I mean by proportionate is a tribunal looks at, does the importance of the aim outweigh the discriminatory effect? And would it be possible actually to have achieved the same aim with a different, less discriminatory approach? If so, that would be unlawful. So going back to that example then of the uniform policy, yes, there's likely to be a legitimate aim there. You know, a company can quite legitimately say, we want everyone to wear a uniform because then they're easily identifiable to our customers. Brilliant. The difficulty you're going to have is that proportionate piece. It would be very, very easy for most employers with the resources that they have to simply make an adjustment to that policy that says if anyone's got an underlying medical condition of any type that means that they need additional sets of uniform, we will also cover the cost of those. Next slide. Employees are protected from harassment, which is considered to be unwanted conduct related to a protected characteristic that has the purpose or effect of violating someone's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for them. Now, it's for example, that might be jokes, banter, I hate that word, comments about menopause or age or hot flushes or HRT, anything that's said in the workplace that makes someone embarrassed or makes them feel uncomfortable in the workplace, they could potentially have a harassment claim. They're also protected from victimisation. So if someone raises a claim or a complaint or a grievance about discriminatory behaviour, or they are involved in someone else's complaint or claim about discriminatory behaviour, and in response to that, they are subjected to a detriment, then they could potentially bring a claim for victimisation. I wanted to highlight at this point that those particular claims can be brought not only against the employer, but also against the individual who's carried out that inappropriate behaviour. So their claims can be brought against individuals too. And that is why it's so important to give your staff appropriate training so that they do know how to behave. And actually, in addition on that point, if an employer can show that it took all reasonable steps to prevent that employee from carrying out that discriminatory act, that would also give that employer a defence to a harassment or victimisation claim. And that is all the reason why you need to give your staff appropriate training, but also that you include it in your equality and diversity information and within any appropriate policies. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a specific menopause policy, but it does mean that you should be highlighting this as a particular thing that people need to be aware of within all the other appropriate policies. For example, performance management and absence management and disciplinary matters in your harassment policy. It needs to be included in all of those. Next slide, please. If an individual can show that they are covered by the definition of disabled within the Equality Act, they also get 2 additional, you've gone a little bit too far. Can you go back one? Thank you. You also need to think about 2 additional obligations and duties you have. One of the additional protections that an individual who's disabled has is that they could also bring a claim if they are subjected to unfavourable treatment because of something that has arisen in consequence of their disability. In this particular type of thing for a menopausal employee, if, for example, someone is not performing or they have conduct or behavioural concerns, but that has arisen as a consequence of their menopausal symptoms, if in response to that they are given a formal warning or ultimately dismissed because of that, they could potentially bring a claim for discrimination arising from disability. Now again, that is not necessarily always unlawful. It again is subject to that requirement for an employer to objectively justify the approach. It's the same test as I mentioned before with indirect discrimination. They need to have a legitimate aim. It needs to be a proportionate means of achieving that legitimate aim. Last slide. And as I mentioned previously, if you are disabled, you also have an additional protection. There's additional obligations on the employer to make reasonable adjustments for you. That means any adjustment that might remove or reduce any substantial disadvantage that you face as a result of any policies, practices, or physical features of the workplace. Now, that could be a whole range of different adjustments. It might be adjustments to HR processes. It might be adjustments to the physical working environment, or adjustments to your working arrangements or working hours, or just providing additional support, for example, medical advice. And I wanted to just finish off by highlighting that obviously my role is to look at the legal risks here, and I think it's really important that obviously employers do understand the legal risks and understand the value of potential claims. But for me, the risk is much wider. It's a much wider employee relations risk that you need to be thinking about as well, and not just the legal bit. Because if you think about the number of people, a quarter of people who are menopausal consider at some point leaving their jobs, that risk is really big in terms of potential loss of knowledge and experience and the costs of recruiting a replacement. If similarly you've got someone who ends up bringing a claim against you, that's in a public arena, so that could impact on people considering applying for jobs with you, so you're impacting potential new recruits. And if you're looking at your current staff, if they get any worry that when they hit the menopausal age that you're not going to support them, that could mean that they leave their job too. And similarly, if even in a wider scale than that, if anybody thinks that somebody with an underlying medical condition of menopause or anything else thinks that you're not going to support them when they've got an underlying medical condition, again, the knock-on effect of that in terms of your staff morale or people leaving could potentially be quite big. So I just wanted to highlight that, yes, legal risk is a really important element of this that you need to understand, but it is obviously much, much bigger in terms of the bigger picture that you need to be thinking about when you're working out what to do next in terms of supporting staff.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Jackie. Really helpful stuff that I think everyone will much appreciate that. Can I just ask you just a quick question? I'm just wondering, so if you have a situation where we've got, say, a senior employee, they have a very important role, I don't know, they're giving advice or they're carrying out critical tenders or presenting or working with your key contacts, anything, those sorts of things, and they are really in the thick of symptoms. If you have concerns about somebody's performance, I mean, obviously what we're hoping today is that people will be going and supporting people, but if we have a concern that actually there is a potential business risk of somebody doing their role, what can or what should employers be doing about that?
Well, I think you don't need to be frightened of it, is what I would say. Is I think you can address conduct concerns, you can address performance concerns, and actually, obviously there's a process and a policy in place that you can follow. The important thing I think to remember is that, and in fact, actually, if someone's got conduct issues, you do have a kind of duty to be dealing with it because it could impact their colleagues, and obviously you've got a responsibility to them too. But I think the important thing to remember is the adjustments piece, because in order to manage those concerns, you would need to probably really understand what their underlying medical condition was, and therefore what impact those things might have on the concerns, and to then work out, actually working with that employee, how you can help them, because the chances are there'll be so many adjustments that you could make that actually would completely resolve the situation to the point where actually there is no need at all to even take any formal action, let alone get anywhere near dismissal. So I think in terms of support that would be expected by a tribunal, there is just a lot of different hoops you have to jump through. So you need to be speaking to that individual, as I say, you're obviously following the ACAS process, but you're basically consulting with that individual, getting advice to really understand how to help them, giving them a fair opportunity to make changes based on any adjustments that you do make, giving them a chance, a proper time frame for that, to be changed, giving them proper information about what the next steps might be, allowing them to be accompanied to meetings, all sorts of things like that. So that, and I'd have thought in the vast majority of cases, it would therefore be resolved without actually ever having to take anything, proper serious.
No, that's really helpful, thank you. And just one other very quick question before I move on. I was just wondering, so obviously if we have situations where perhaps people haven't either disclosed, they may well not know that they're menopausal themselves, so if the employer doesn't know, can employers still be liable in that situation? We still sort of face the same risk of claims?
Yes, obviously. Yes, and I think they need to be careful about it, because there's obviously some of the claims that I've been talking about that's not really, you don't even really need to know anything about someone's underlying condition. You know, if you start treating somebody unreasonably, or you're not, you know, you don't have a fair reason for dismissal, for example, all of those things could result in a constructive unfair dismissal claim or an unfair dismissal claim, for example, without even needing to understand any underlying medical condition. I think obviously there'll be some of these types of claims, like for example direct discrimination. If someone doesn't even know they're menopausal, it's unlikely they're going to be able to bring a direct discrimination claim to say, well, you only did this because I was menopausal. Obviously that would be much harder. I think there are some types of claim, for example, direct discrimination, failure to make reasonable adjustments, and your discrimination arising from a disability that do require actual or constructive knowledge of the disability. But this is where it gets tricky, because constructive knowledge is really, really difficult. Constructive knowledge is basically a tribunal would still say that you had constructive knowledge that someone is disabled, if they would expect you to reasonably have been aware that they had an underlying medical condition. So that would apply even if the individual themselves had no idea and didn't disclose it to you and didn't have any idea that they might have an underlying medical condition. If based on all the information available to that employer, there's enough for the tribunal to say, actually, you should have known about this. For example, if out of the blue somebody suddenly had a dip in performance, or someone suddenly had you know, behavioural concerns that they've never had before, they're suddenly behaving in a slightly different way than they used to, or they've suddenly in the last 3 months had a much higher amount of short-term sickness absence, or maybe your sick notes are saying things like anxiety and migraines. All of that, if you take it in the whole of all the information that's then available to the employer, that might be enough for a tribunal to say, actually, you've got constructive knowledge of this. And at the very least, it then allows the tribunal to say, okay, you might not have known exactly what was going on, but you should at least have taken steps to find out, either by talking to the individual or obviously ultimately getting medical advice or occupational health advice to understand more.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Jackie. Right, okay, well, let's press on, because I'm conscious we've only got half an hour left already. I don't know where the time's been flying today. We do have another poll, which I think is going to pop up onto your screen. Just check you're all still with us. Here it is. Right, so this one is asking, do you anticipate difficulties in getting your organisation on board with introducing different pathways of menopause support? And I think what we're trying to get at here is whether you think your business will perhaps need to increase awareness of the menopause, raise its profile, or otherwise, somehow perhaps change your culture before you can really charge forth and introduce any specific levels of support for affected employees. So the options here that we've got for you to answer are definitely, maybe, no, or not sure. So I'll give you another couple of moments just to answer that one. Hopefully that should be a fairly easy response. So let's have a look. Oh, actually, yeah. I mean, interesting again. And actually, I think this is a topic that's going to be touched on by our next two speakers who've obviously been through this and seen whether there is that sort of requirement for changing culture or different things that need to be put in place before this can really get started. So without further ado, I'm going to move straight on. As I say, we've had the what, we've had the the why it matters, and we've had the legal perspective. And so I will move on now to our final two speakers, Emma and Rebecca. They've both been on some incredibly interesting journeys within their own organisations and very, very kindly have given up their time to come and speak to us today to hopefully share some experiences. I'm really hoping that this will sort of put it into context, I suppose, give us some food for thought about some different types of steps that can be taken from people who've actually been through this, they've done it themselves. So Rebecca, you're up first, over to you.
Thank you, Katie. Well, perhaps I should start with explaining why, for me personally, this is such an important issue. I was just so unprepared. For me, it was chronic insomnia. I mean, if I got 3 hours sleep, that was a good night. 3 or 4 nights a week, I would get no sleep at all. And that was week after week, month after month. And to be honest, I simply couldn't function. And the only way I managed to keep going and not give up work altogether was because of the support and the understanding that I had from friends and colleagues at work. And that was 7 years ago, and I still have times when I really struggle. And I know there'll be women watching this that feel that they can't talk about menopause at work. And so I feel there's this huge responsibility on all of us to make it normal for everyone to talk about menopause, but especially at work. So what have we been doing at Savills? Well, we've set up a menopause support group, and we've got a dedicated page on our company intranet. So this is where we regularly post articles and links to helpful external sources of information, and we advertise future events, and we post recordings of previous ones. We're also introducing a specific menopause policy, which provides practical guidance on what a manager needs to know about menopause, and how to effectively support their team. And it also provides reassurance for employees on how menopause-related issues, will be managed and what support's available to them. Now, we understand that not all women want to talk about menopause at work, and that's absolutely fine. The main thing is that we create a culture of understanding, where women feel comfortable openly discussing their symptoms and how it's affecting their working lives. Now, in early October, we ran a company-wide webinar on menopause in the workplace. We were incredibly lucky to have Dr. Heather Curry, MBE, as our guest speaker, and some of those listening might be aware of her website called Menopause Matters. And the Menopause Matters magazine, actually, it's now available actually on High Street, which is great. The webinar was introduced by our MD, and it was chaired by our Head of Residential Lettings, who also sits on the UK board. And having this senior level support was just such a great endorsement and made all the difference. So I talked to a few slides with some of the key facts and statistics, and we've heard from Michelle earlier some of this, that 75% of women will experience symptoms. And for 25%, those symptoms will just be so debilitating, they will need significant support at work. And I looked at the statistics within Savills, and the economic consequences are obvious, as we've said. These women have masses of experience and talent, often at the peak of their careers. It just makes no sense to lose them or for them not to be performing at their best. And yet, at the moment, the impact of menopause is hidden. This is because it's still not openly talked about. And it means that the actual impact is just simply not recognised. So we did a radio-style Q&A format, which worked really well. And in terms of attendance, we think we had well over 500 people watch at the time. We're not totally sure because many teams joined in boardrooms across the country, but I'm telling you, for Savills, that's a lot of people. In terms of training and support, we recently held a couple of workshops, and they were hosted by colleagues of Michelle at Henpicked. We had an employee session in the morning and one for managers in the afternoon. And again, we had a really good attendance. The events helped women to be more aware and recognise the symptoms, because not all do. And we gave them advice about how to discuss the menopause with their line managers and ask for support. And for managers, the event explained how to recognise and understand menopause symptoms and the impact, of course, that might have at work, how to have those sensitive conversations and feel more comfortable just talking about menopause openly. So looking forward, well, at the moment, we're organising menopause workplace champions. So a whole group of women across the country that other women know that they can go to for friendly chat, and point them in the right direction. And we're looking at specific training for these menopause champions in the new year. And then we hope to facilitate a network of local support groups across the country and build up, chat forums and things like that. But before I hand back to Katie, I just want to say that whilst I do really think we have achieved an awful lot in this last year, we're also only just at the beginning. There's just so much more to do. And of course, it needs to be an ongoing process. You don't just do these things once and then that's it. So we're looking at to rerun events that we've hosted this year every year and continue to raise awareness through events like this, actually. So, thanks, Katie.
Wow, I mean, it's absolutely wonderful, and congratulations on how far you've come. It's incredible stuff, actually. You've done so well. It's wonderful to hear. Just out of interest, actually, with your with the webinar that you ran, do you know what the demographic of that was? Was it sort of men, women, certain ages, certain roles within the company who attended?
Yeah. Well, it was predominantly women, but actually, if we say 500, because we don't really know, there was about 400 women and about 100 men. But as I say, there were many more that watched in boardrooms, and we know that some of the men joined others to come and watch it, especially young men. Actually, there were quite a lot in their 20s and 30s, and we got some questions from those young men, you know, along the lines of, what can I do to help at the time? You know, it's just really nice to hear young people wanting to support other people in an area that they don't know anything about. So yes, although mostly women watched, there was a good percentage of men. And what was really good to see that was the fact that most of the men that attended were directors or in senior management roles, which of course is really good, because it's something that the women have been concerned about. You know, how do we educate the managers? How do we get that management support?
I mean, it's fantastic to hear, actually, because I can imagine it's one of the struggles that sometimes projects such as this can face, and you know, getting actually the different areas of the business involved, and that's wonderful to hear. Did you have much feedback after your session?
Oh yeah. Yeah, we had, you know, it was overwhelmingly positive. In fact, it really did feel quite groundbreaking. Lots of responses from the directors, associate directors, which was great, because I say that creating this culture of support, you know, comes from the top. But I'm going to read you some of the quotes. I just want to give you some of the quotes that we had. So one chap said, I appreciate that to some it may be an uncomfortable topic, but the reality is that the impact of menopause touches us all at some point, either through our wife, partner, or colleagues. Fantastic job to both raise awareness and get people talking about such an important topic. That was a sort of classic, you know, we've got lots like that. We had one lady who said, thank you for bringing this subject to the fore. I was very close to leaving as I thought I was having a breakdown. Working with mainly male surveyors for 33 years, I struggled at first how to approach the subject with my manager, but he was extremely helpful, and we've worked out an improved working environment. I now am not embarrassed to have a complete blank in the middle of a meeting when I have 8 directors listening to me. The first time this happened was mortifying. Again, thank you, and I look forward to hearing what else you have planned. So we had a senior director say, my whole team watched together and everyone found it informative and interesting. It also prompted some really positive conversations on topics that we hadn't discussed before. So that, you know, that's brilliant. Couple more. Another director said, I interviewed someone in the afternoon and mentioned it as an example of what is so good about working here. I thought that's on that recruitment point that was mentioned earlier. Another lady said, it's opportunities like this that help break down any stigma, discomfort around talking about menopause. Brilliant to see so many men on the call as well. And then the last one, which was quite moving, said, I learned so much from this webinar, even had some of my mystery symptoms explained. So helpful, it made me cry with emotion.
Goodness. Oh, I mean, it's incredible, actually, isn't it? It's really wonderful to hear. And I think that knowledge that people do want to support each other, you know, knowledge is so incredibly valuable. And the more that you can do on this front, the better. Well, goodness, I could ask you so many questions, Rebecca. I really could. I'm conscious of time though, so we will hand over to Emma to cover what they've been up to in her workplace. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Katie. There should be some slides, hopefully. Is that okay, Lauren?
Yeah, I think they'll pop up. There we go.
Fantastic. Thank you. You can skip over the top of the slide. I don't think anyone needs to read that. Sorry, Lauren. Could you go to the second slide? Brilliant, thank you. So this is perhaps only very slightly tongue-in-cheek, but if you do a Google search for menopausal women and look at the images that come up, and if you read a sort of a tabloid journalist article about the menopause, these are the kinds of stereotypical images that might come up. If you go to the next slide, please. What we actually look like is, of course, very, very different. So I think we've talked a lot about, about the symptoms and about the struggle that people have. But I guess the counterpoint I wanted to make was that actually some of the stigma and the taboo that perhaps people kind of struggle with is down to media portrayal of kind of midlife women in kind of their menopausal years, and that can actually prevent people from kind of coming forward and being really open and having those honest conversations. Could you go to the next slide, please? So that was perhaps slightly glib, but actually I think there's a lot of truth around that. So, when we've got these sort of very stereotypical images and the sort of, the sort of, when people talk about hot flushes and, the sort of old-fashioned attitudes of sort of laughing at those kind of menopausal symptoms, are we surprised that people are a bit reluctant to come out and have those open and honest and frank conversations, and that there's shame and stigma attached, that we feel that we might be unfairly judged or overlooked for promotion or kind of just written off because of our kind of age or stage of life. But this is changing, and I think, Michelle talked a bit about, the sort of the Channel 4 documentary that Davina presented, which was really groundbreaking. There are more and more women in this kind of cohort going into menopause now, talking very honestly and openly about their experiences. And I love this quote that came from a Forbes article recently. Gen X women might be the first generation to feel truly entitled to be heard. We're not going down quietly, and why should we? Next slide, please. So what I wanted to talk to you about was the employee resource group that I co-chair in my organisation. It's a global organisation with about 8,000 employees worldwide. Our ERG is focused on empowering women, but actually we're very inclusive. We do have male members of the ERG, male colleagues on our steering group, for example. We've been very active since 2015, but during COVID, we pivoted to become a purely online organisation. We put on at least one event a month with good attendance for those. We do various programs around sort of mentoring, networking, supporting women returners. We've got here what we used to call lean-in circles, all kinds of things going on. So middle of this year, I decided to kick off our Menopause Mondays. We have a Yammer channel for anyone that uses Office 365. You may have something similar, or a kind of discussion board. And so the idea behind that was to start sharing articles, podcasts, all different kinds of resources to kind of help, like Rebecca was saying, opening up those conversations, smashing the stigma, smashing the taboo, actually getting people to engage with this topic and get it out in the open. And, this is nothing that we should be ashamed of. We should be talking about this. Why are we not talking about this? And so that's a weekly post, which I do with our team of menopause champions, which brings us on to the next point. So in conjunction with launching the Menopause Mondays campaign, there were a small group of us that were allied to our ERG that had been talking about the topic. We decided we would go ahead and launch our own Menopause Champions initiative, which sounds like it has a lot of parallels with what Rebecca was doing at Savills. And we kicked that off with a sort of soft launch on World Menopause Day on the 18th of October with our very first Menopause Cafe. So again, this was quite low key. The idea being that we would have a sort of a 1 hour session on Teams, Microsoft Teams, where people could come. It would be entirely confidential. They could just kind of chat to the small group of menopause champions, and the idea being that if we had a good response to that we would run that more regularly. So as the slide says, it was a small group. So we probably had as many sort of colleagues who weren't menopause champions joining us who were menopause champions, but it got really good responses from people. And so what I'm hopeful is that we'll run that again, and with a bit more sort of lead time, probably publicity, that we'll get more people joining. And actually, we had at least one or two people from outside of the UK even joining, because we promoted it globally. So yeah, I'm hopeful that's the sort of the start of something bigger. I think I've got another slide. Thank you. So yeah, intranet, we use SharePoint for our intranet. So the Menopause Champions have their own page. We'll be carrying on the Menopause Monday campaign. I think we'll probably do our menopause cafes quarterly. We're working quite closely with our people and culture team, HR by any other name. And the next step for us really is to pull together a whole bunch of resources for managers to make sure that our colleagues can feel safe and supported having those difficult conversations. One of the things I didn't mention actually in my slide is that our company just recently, I think again over the summer, introduced access to PEPI, which is an app, PEPI Health for colleagues in the UK, and that provides completely confidential support for employees in 3 areas. So menopause, pregnancy and fertility. I forgot what the other one is. Maybe it's pregnancy and fertility / infertility. I think it's and new parenting. Sorry. So that again, I think they were quite surprised to find that out of all the people who'd registered to get access to PEPI, that more than a third had picked menopause as the area that they were looking for support with, which surprised me actually. So my contact details are on the next slide, and that's it from me. Wonderful.
Gosh, well, thank you so much. I mean, it's so interesting to hear what different businesses are doing and what's working and how it's going. So huge thanks to both you, Emma and Rebecca, for sharing that today. Right, we're going to move in to a quick Q&A session. I know that Jackie's been sort of having a look through the questions that have come in so far. I have as well. Jackie, have you got one that you'd like to kick off with?
I would be interested actually. One of the questions, which is kind of similar to what you were saying, Emma, is that someone just wants to know the participants on this call. Are they mainly individuals that identify as female? And I would like to say that actually, yes, the majority of them are individuals that would identify as female, but there are, probably a fifth are male. And actually, we have had a lot of, people who have been really interested in the topic, as we've been highlighting it around the business, not only within FSP and then outside externally, and it really has been a topic that people are interested in finding out more about, across all genders. So I think that's interesting to know. One of the questions we've had is, an individual has asked, is it difficult to make the right people understand that menopause policy should be a sit-alone document and not part of a well-being and mental health policy? How did you manage to get a menopause policy as a standalone? And actually, I'm quite interested to know, kind of just generally speaking, what your experiences have been in terms of these policies, because in my mind, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, really.
Shall I just take that first? I just wondered, because I did have a little bit of scepticism at the beginning. People's basically saying, well, we've not had a problem so far, have we? And it's because it's hidden, because people haven't talked about it, so they didn't really think it was something we needed to resolve. And in the end, really, I was battling against that sort of attitude a little bit. The other thing is, as we were preparing our webinar, we actually had some opposition from senior women in the company to actually using the word menopause, and that was all because of the stigma and the negative connotations associated with it. And so, that was again another battle, sort of arguing why we should use the menopause as obviously as a word, and it was absolutely the right thing to do. But in the end, I think the menopause policy is great because it's I think for managers really, not so much for the women necessarily, because I think we all need to talk about it. But I think managers sometimes like somewhere to go and have a look at, well, written down, what are the symptoms, what should I be doing, have a toolkit, somewhere to signpost. I don't know whether that answers the question or not, Jackie, really.
Perfect. Thank you.
If I could just add in quickly,
Yes, please.
I was just going to say, if I can just add on to that, absolutely. We work with organisations that actually the personnel have said we'd rather not have a menopause policy because we don't want to be pigeonholed. So there's that side of it. So we, working with lots of organisations who have adapted existing policies to ensure that they're fit for purpose around this subject, and then produced an overriding guidance document. We've also got organisations who have completely rewritten an existing policy looking at disability and long-term health management to make sure that it has the right thing. I think above all, it's making sure that everybody knows where is it. I can certainly remember working for corporate organisations that in the chairman's office, there would probably a wall to ceiling of policies in files that nobody knew where they were, nobody knew what they meant. Because now we have the internet, we have all sorts of channels. So whatever way you go about it, it's making sure it's fit for purpose. It does the job it's required to do. It provides the relevant protections for all parties, and everybody knows where it is and what does it mean to them within their roles and responsibilities. But yeah, it's a very diverse subject, and again, it's what's right for each individual organisation rather than, oh, we have to have a policy because.
Absolutely, and actually there is another question that came in that touches on that, so I'm not going to read it word for word, I'll just sort of proceed it. So obviously there are different businesses of all sorts of different sizes listening today. I think we've got some with thousands of employees, some with only a handful. So some people it will be practical to do very large scale things, some people will probably want something smaller. So I suppose the question, what it's trying to get to is something better than nothing? What's the one thing that somebody of any size can implement? So if they've got a small business, what's the one thing they could take away from today and implement and change to make a business? And I'm conscious that we're pretty tight on time, so if there's any quick response to that, that would be super from anybody.
Just start talking about it.
Just talk about it. Absolutely. Obviously something is better than nothing. We've just got to talk about it, and I think just education. It's all about education. So a small lunch and learn. It doesn't have to be a big external webinar like this. Just a little group, even with your team, over sandwiches, to just introduce the subject and start talking about it. That's where you've got to start, isn't it?
Right.
I think that's a really important point, is that it's allowing people to feel comfortable bringing their experience to the table, right? So by kicking off the conversation first, you're enabling them to kind of, you're lowering the barrier for them to kind of to have that trust in the organisation that there will be kind of an empathetic, helpful, supportive response. So even if that's the only thing you do, you're at least giving people that sort of comfort in
I think that's it, isn't it? The employee relationships, the soft stuff is often as important as the grand gestures. And right, well, I'm conscious that we have other questions. What we will probably need to do is we will contact those people who we haven't managed to answer questions today. I'm so sorry that we've started to run out of time. One thing I will just say is, obviously, for those of you who aren't sure what to do next, if you aren't quite ready to launch headfirst into making menopause support your mission for 2022, one thing that has been mentioned at various points today is actually perhaps look at your flexible working policies. Those sorts of practices, some elements of that might be just enough to help people if you're not quite there as far as the bigger stuff goes just yet. On that note, I will just very quickly mention that we do have, as luck would have it, we do have another webinar coming up in December, where our colleague David Clay will be taking you through all things flexible working related. So I do hope that lots of people will sign up to that. It should be a really interesting session, particularly at a time where flexible working is still absolutely huge post-pandemic. It's not going anywhere. So it's something that's really worthwhile spending some time looking at. Well, goodness, I mean, absolutely fantastic session today. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, Michelle, Rebecca, Emma, and of course, Jackie. I can't say how much your contribution today has been massively appreciated. It really has. And thank you also hugely to our audience. I really do hope that you found the session interesting and useful today. If there is anything that you haven't had a chance to ask, please do just get in touch with us. We'd be very happy to help where we can. In the meantime, just another quick push, please, if you would. We would absolutely love to have your feedback from today. When the session closes in just a couple of minutes time, there will be that feedback that will pop up on your screens. Don't forget, there is the chance to win that £50 John Lewis voucher. If you want to be entered to draw that, please give us your details. That would be super. We are very conscious this is a slightly different style to the webinars that we normally tend to run, so your feedback would be hugely appreciated. Well, thank you very much, and we will hope to see you again at another event soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.